I didn't take the job at Blackwood Falls because I loved nature. I took it because I owed $40,000 to a man in Seattle who communicated exclusively through bruised ribs and slashed tires, and because the job paid $50,000 for 6 months of absolute, uninterrupted isolation. My name is Elias Vance. Up until a year ago, I was a mid-level project manager at a tech startup that promised to revolutionize the way we interact with household appliances. It was all smoke, mirrors, and venture capitalist money. When the CEO vanished to a non-extradition country with the company's remaining funds, I was left holding the bag for a series of off-the-books loans I had foolishly co-signed to keep the servers running. I lost my apartment, my fiancé, and my peace of mind in the span of 3 weeks. I needed to disappear, and I needed to do it while making enough cash to buy my life back. That's what I saw the listing on a buried forum board for seasonal employment. Winter caretaker required, Blackwood Falls Historic Lodge, November 1st to April 30th. Must be comfortable with extreme isolation, heavy snowfall, and self-reliance. No internet, satellite phone for emergencies only. $50,000 upon completion of contract. Do not apply if you cannot handle being entirely alone. The interview was a 5-minute phone call with a man named Mr. Sterling. He had a voice like grinding stones and didn't ask about my resume. He only asked 3 questions. Do you have a criminal record? Do you drink? Are you afraid of the dark? I answered no to all 3. He told me the keys would be under the mat at the supply office in town and hung up. The drive up into the Cascade Mountains was a descent into a different world. As my beat-up Subaru Outback clawed its way up the winding, deteriorating asphalt of Route 118, the sprawling metropolis of Seattle faded into a gray memory, replaced by the towering, oppressive walls of Douglas firs and red cedars. The trees here were ancient, their massive trunks covered in thick, pale green moss that looked like a sickly skin. The higher I drove, the tighter the trees seemed to crowd the road, their branches interlacing overhead to block out the pale autumn sun. My last stop for gas was a town called Oak Haven, a depressing stretch of 3 blocks featuring a diner, a hardware store, and a single pump station. The attendant, a kid who couldn't have been older than 19 with grease-stained hands and a nervous twitch, filled my tank in silence. When I went to hand him the cash, he noticed the printed map on my passenger seat with the Blackwood Lodge circled in red marker. You the new winter guy? He asked, his voice barely rising above the whistle of the mountain wind. That's right, I said, trying to muster a confident smile. 6 months of getting paid to read books and shovel snow. The kid didn't smile back. He looked past me, up toward the jagged peaks hidden behind low-hanging, bruised clouds. Arthur, the guy who did it last year, he came down early, mid-February, left his truck running at the gates and walked the 12 miles down the mountain in a blizzard, lost 3 toes to frostbite. Why didn't he just drive? I asked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The kid handed me my change. Said the truck wouldn't let him leave alone. Said there was someone sitting in the back seat every time he looked in the rear view. Good luck, mister. Keep the fires hot. I brushed it off. Cabin fever is a real, documented psychological phenomenon. Stick a guy in a drafty old building by himself for 4 months with nothing but canned beans and his own thoughts, and his brain is bound to start manufacturing company. I was different. I was highly motivated by the fear of my kneecaps being shattered. I could handle some phantom hitchhikers. By the time I reached the end of the pavement, the rain had turned to a hard, freezing sleet. The road transformed into a deeply rutted gravel path that wound through the forest for another 5 miles. My radio signal had died an hour ago, leaving me with nothing but the static hiss of dead air and the rhythmic, aggressive thumping of my windshield wipers. Then I saw it. Blackwood Falls Lodge was a massive, sprawling structure built in the 1920s by some forgotten timber baron. It sat on the edge of a frozen black lake, surrounded on 3 sides by a dense, impenetrable wall of pine trees. The lodge was constructed of dark, unvarnished logs and river stone, featuring 3 massive chimneys and a wraparound porch that seemed to sag under the weight of decades of snow. It looked less like a resort and more like a fortress designed to keep something out, or keep something in. I parked the Subaru near the woodshed, the sound of the engine dying leaving a ringing silence in my ears, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like water pressure against your eardrums. I grabbed my duffel bag and the cardboard box of non-perishables I'd brought and walked up the creaking wooden steps to the heavy oak front door. The key I'd picked up in Oakhaven turned in the lock with a stiff clack. I pushed the door open, stepping into a cavernous main hall. The air inside was freezing, smelling of old ash, pine needles, and dust. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room, illuminating sheets draped over massive leather sofas, a colossal stone fireplace that could easily fit a standing man, and the mounted heads of elk and deer lining the balcony railing above. Their glass eyes seemed to reflect my light with a dull, accusatory glare. I spent the next 2 hours familiarizing myself with the layout. The place was a labyrinth of long corridors, drafty guest rooms, all locked, thankfully, an industrial kitchen that echoed with every step, and a basement that housed the massive diesel generator and the boiler. My quarters were in a small, self-contained apartment attached to the rear of the kitchen, presumably where the head staff used to live. It was cozy enough: a twin bed, a small desk, a wood-burning stove, and a window that looked out toward the tree line at the back of the property. It was on the small desk in my room that I found the letter. It was enclosed in a thick manila envelope with the words, "For the caretaker," written in sharp, erratic block letters. I dumped my bags on the bed, struck a match to light the kerosene lantern on the desk, and opened the envelope. Inside were 3 pages of yellowed legal pad paper. The first page was entirely normal. It detailed the maintenance schedule. Run the generator for 4 hours every 2 days to keep the batteries topped up. Check the antifreeze in the boiler pipes daily. Keep the snow cleared from the main porch and the exhaust vents. Inventory the canned goods in the pantry. Standard caretaker stuff. I flipped to the second page. The handwriting here was different. The neat administrative cursive of the first page was replaced by frantic, heavily indented print. The pen had been pressed so hard into the paper that it had nearly torn through. At the top it read, "Rules for surviving the winter. Do not ignore these." I chuckled, pulling up a chair. Here we go, I thought. The hazing ritual. The old guy trying to scare the new guy. I leaned in to read the list. 1. The generator runs loudly. You will hear it humming through the floorboards. If the humming stops, you have exactly 10 minutes to get to the basement and restart it. However, if the humming does not stop, but you hear what sounds like a voice humming along with it, do not go to the basement. Turn off all the lights in your room, get under the blanket, and plug your ears. Do not listen to the melody. If you learn the song, you will never stop singing it. 2. Every Tuesday, around 3 p.m., the antique rotary phone in the main lobby will ring. This phone is not connected to any lines. The wires were cut in 1985. You must answer it before the 5th ring. Pick up the receiver, say, "The master of the house is sleeping," and hang up immediately. Do not listen to the other end. If you hear breathing before you speak, drop the phone and lock yourself in your room until Wednesday. 3. When clearing snow from the back porch, you may notice a set of tracks leading out of the woods and stopping exactly at the edge of the porch steps. They will look like barefoot human footprints, but they will be impossibly large. Ignore them. Sweep the snow over them. Never, under any circumstances, try to follow the tracks back into the woods to see where they came from. It wants you to follow. 4. There is a deer that frequents the edge of the Black Lake. You will recognize it because its left antler is snapped cleanly in half and its eyes face forward like a predator's, not on the sides of its head. If you see it looking at you through a window, do not break eye contact. Back away slowly until you are out of the room If you turn your back on it while it is watching you, it will be inside the lodge by the time you turn around. 5. Between the hours of 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., the lodge will shift. Wood settles, pipes bang. This is normal. But if you hear the distinct sound of heavy, wet footsteps walking on the ceiling of your bedroom, you must not move. Do not cough. Do not reach for your flashlight. It is blind, but its hearing is perfect. It thinks the floorboards are the ground, and it is looking for a way down. 6. If you find a door open that you know you locked, lock it again and say loudly, "The wind is fierce tonight." Do not acknowledge that someone opened it. I stared at the paper for a long time. The silence of the lodge pressed in on me, suddenly feeling much heavier than before. The wind howled outside, rattling the single-pane window of my room. "Very funny, Arthur," I muttered out loud, my voice sounding weak and thin in the cold air. "Hell of a creative writing project." I tossed the papers onto the desk and rubbed my eyes. It was a prank. It had to be. Guys who spend too much time in the woods get weird. They develop a twisted sense of humor. He probably left this here, laughing his frostbitten toes off at the thought of the new guy shaking in his boots. I stood up and decided to get the fire started. I needed heat, and I needed to get the generator running so I could have some actual light. I wasn't going to let a piece of paper spook me on night 1. I had 40,000 reasons to stay exactly where I was. I grabbed a stack of chopped wood from the small pile in the corner of the room and shoved it into the cast-iron stove, striking a long match to catch the kindling. As the fire roared to life, casting dancing orange shadows against the timber walls, I felt a fraction of the tension leave my shoulders. I'm fine, I told myself. I'm alone. I'm safe. I walked over to the window to pull the heavy canvas curtains shut for the night. The sun had completely vanished behind the mountains, leaving the woods outside submerged in a deep, inky blackness. The snow was falling harder now, blowing in sideways sheets across the frozen surface of the lake. I reached for the curtain string, my eyes adjusting to the dark outside. And there, standing at the very edge of the tree line, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the rising moon reflecting off the snow, was a silhouette. It was the shape of a deer, but it was standing perfectly still, facing the lodge. Even from this distance, through the blinding snow and the darkness, I could see two things with absolute, terrifying clarity. The left antler was snapped jaggedly in half, and its eyes, reflecting the dim light of my kerosene lantern, were positioned squarely on the front of its face, staring directly into mine. I froze, my hand hovering over the curtain string. The rational part of my brain screamed that it was a trick of the light, a shadow, a sick coincidence. But my body knew better. A primal, ancient terror spiked in my blood, freezing me to the spot. I remembered Rule 4. Do not break eye contact. Back away slowly. My heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, I kept my eyes locked on the two glowing orbs in the dark. I took one slow, agonizing step backward, then another. The creature outside did not move, but its gaze felt like a physical weight pressing against the glass. I backed up until my shoulders hit the wooden door of my room. I reached behind me, my fingers fumbling blindly for the brass doorknob. I found it, turned it, and slipped out into the freezing, pitch-black corridor of the kitchen, pulling the door shut in front of me with a soft click. I stood in the dark kitchen, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. It was only my first night at Blackwood Falls Lodge, and I suddenly realized, with a sickening drop in my stomach, that the rules weren't a prank at all. They were a manual for survival. I stood frozen in the pitch-black industrial kitchen, my back pressed against the cold steel of a prep table. The darkness was a suffocating blanket, smelling of ancient grease and my own terrified sweat. Rule 4. If you break eye contact, it will be inside the lodge by the time you turn around. I had pulled the door shut. Did that count as turning my back? Then the tapping started. Tap, tap, tap. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound against my bedroom window, like a hardened fingernail clicking on frosty glass. A moment later, the heavy brass handle of the exterior kitchen door, just 10 feet away, began to jiggle. It turned slowly, testing the deadbolt. Then it snapped back with a sharp click. Suddenly, the power died. The refrigerator's comforting drone vanished. The lodge was plunged into an absolute abyss. The generator's battery banks had completely drained. I needed light, and the boiler needed power, or I'd freeze to death before morning. According to Rule 1, I had exactly 10 minutes to restart the generator. With trembling hands, I flicked on my tactical flashlight. Its thin beam cut through the crushing dark as I crept out of the kitchen and across the cavernous gray hall. The mounted elk heads on the balcony seemed to glare at me from the shadows. I reached the heavy steel door labeled basement, turned the brass key, and pulled it open. A wave of freezing air and a sickeningly sweet stench of rot hit me. The flashlight beam revealed the steep concrete stairs descending into black, oily water. The basement had flooded. I had no choice. I waded down, the freezing sludge splashing past my heavy boots. The generator sat in the center of the subterranean room like a dormant iron beast. I grabbed the manual fuel pump and cranked it until my shoulders burned with lactic acid, ignoring the oppressive feeling of being watched from the pitch-black corners. At exactly 25 seconds of holding the starter plug, I heard a heavy splash from the darkness behind the boiler. Something large was dragging itself through the water. I didn't turn around. I yanked the main starter lever with all my strength. The generator exploded into life with a deafening roar and a thick cloud of blue exhaust. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glare across the basement. Then the symphony began. It was a massive, harmonizing hum that wove flawlessly into the roaring pistons. If the humming does not stop, do not go to the basement. But I was already here. The voice sounded like a drowning choir of thousands, singing a melody of pure, seductive despair. It vibrated in my jawbone, compelling my own lips to part. I felt an overwhelming, hypnotic urge to sing along. I bit down on my tongue hard. The sharp pain and the metallic taste of blood snapped me out of the trance. I turned to run, but my left boot wouldn't move. Rising from the black water was a cluster of pale, waterlogged roots, or perhaps impossibly long fingers. They were wrapped tightly around my ankle, dragging me steadily backward into the dark. Panic detonated in my chest. I kicked wildly with my free boot, striking the cold, rubbery flesh. On the third violent strike, the grip loosened just enough. I tore my foot free, leaving my boot's heel behind, and stumbled towards stairs. Behind me, the beautiful humming instantly morphed into an angry, shrieking hurricane of disappointed voices. I scrambled up the concrete steps on all fours, throwing myself through the doorway and slamming the heavy steel door shut just as something massive crashed against the other side. The iron hinges shrieked, but they held. I didn't stop to breathe. I ran blindly through the dark lodge, locked myself in my bedroom, shoved my heavy oak dresser against the door, and collapsed onto my bed. I stripped off my soaked clothes, built a roaring fire in the stove, and stared at my watch. It was 1:45 a.m. My tongue throbbed and my ankle bruised, but the adrenaline kept me painfully awake. Rule 5. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., if you hear wet footsteps on the ceiling, you must not move. At exactly 2:12 a.m., the entire lodge groaned. The air pressure in the room dropped violently. Then, from above the kitchen, I heard it. Squish, thud, squish, thud. It sounded like two massive slabs of wet meat slamming against the floorboards above me. The entire building shuddered under the immense, impossible weight. The steps moved steadily, purposefully, toward my room. I stopped breathing. I became a statue under the blankets. The steps entered the space directly above my bed. The heavy timber ceiling plank warped downward under the weight, showering dust onto my face. I could hear a wet, rattling, congested breathing vibrating right through the wood. The footsteps stopped. It was standing directly over my face. Where two timber planks met, there was a small knothole. I watched in unblinking horror as a thick, black tar-like substance pooled at the splintered edge. A single drop fell, landing squarely on my left cheek. It burned like concentrated battery acid, smelling of a stagnant mass grave. The physical pain was agonizing. My survival instinct screamed at me to wipe it away, to move, but I knew if I rustled the blankets, the blind creature would realize the floor beneath it was hollow. It would smash through and take me. Sniff. Sniff. It was inhaling deeply, smelling my fear and my burning flesh through the hole. Heavy, iron-like claws began to slowly scratch the wood above me. Scritch. My lungs were screaming for oxygen. My vision was going completely dark. Moving only a millimeter, I parted my dry lips and let out the thinnest sliver of air. The scratching stopped immediately. The massive creature went terrifyingly still. For 3 agonizing minutes, neither of us moved a muscle. Then, slowly, squish, thud. It took a step backward. The warping weight lifted from the board. The sloshing steps retreated across the ceiling, fading slowly into the cavernous depths of the lodge. I lay perfectly still while the black acid burned a raw, weeping welt into my cheek. I did not dare move a single muscle until my clock silently clicked to 4:01 a.m. Only then did I turn my head, vomit onto the floor, and sob into the darkness. 1 night down, 5 grueling months to go. The morning brought no comfort, only a gray, bruised light that bled through the heavy canvas curtains of my room. I woke up on the floor, my body tangled in the wool blankets I had dragged down with me in the early hours of dawn. Every muscle in my body ached as if I had been beaten, but the sharpest pain was concentrated on my left cheek. I dragged myself into the small attached bathroom and flipped on the battery-powered lantern. The reflection in the mirror made my stomach turn. The black, acidic substance from the ceiling had burned a perfect, blistered circle into my skin, about the size of a silver dollar. The edges were angry and crimson, the center a raw, weeping yellow. I cleaned it with shaking hands, dousing a cotton pad and rubbing alcohol. The sting was blinding, bringing fresh tears to my eyes, but I bit down on a rolled-up towel to keep from screaming. I bandaged the burn tightly with sterile gauze and medical tape. I had survived my first night at Blackwood Falls, but I carried the lodge's brand on my face. Running away wasn't an option. My Subaru was parked outside, but without the heavy plow truck, the 12 miles of unpaved, deeply rutted gravel road back to Oakhaven would be impassable in this fresh snow. Even if I made it on foot, which I wouldn't, not without freezing to death or being hunted by whatever wore the deerskin, I had nowhere to go. The men in Seattle were waiting. My only way out was through. 6 months. I brewed a pot of incredibly strong black coffee on the cast iron stove, trying to force my terrified brain into a state of logical, systematic operation. I pulled Arthur's yellowed list of rules to the center of the table and smoothed out the creases. Tuesday, I thought. Today is Tuesday. According to Rule 2, the antique rotary phone in the main lobby would ring at exactly 3 p.m. I had to answer it before the 5th ring, state a specific phrase, and hang up. Simple enough. But first, I had daily chores. If I let the lodge fall into disrepair, the elements would kill me just as surely as the monsters. Armed with my tactical flashlight, a heavy steel snow shovel, and a renewed, desperate focus, I ventured out of my room. The great hall was silent in the daylight, the oppressive shadows banished by the pale sun streaming through the high windows. The air was frigid, the generator having shut off properly on its timer. I needed to clear the snow from the back porch and exhaust vents. I bundled up in my heavy parka, unbolted the heavy rear kitchen door, and stepped out into the freezing mountain air. The cold was a physical shock, instantly freezing the moisture in my nostrils. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a pristine, unbroken sea of blinding white stretching out toward the dense wall of pine trees. The black lake in the distance looked like a sheet of obsidian. I began shoveling the thick layer of snow off the wooden deck, the rhythmic scraping of metal against wood providing a small human comfort in the vast wilderness. I worked my way toward the stairs leading down to the yard. That's when I saw them. Rule 3. When clearing snow from the back porch, you may notice a set of tracks leading out of the woods and stopping exactly at the edge of the porch steps. They will look like barefoot human footprints, but they will be impossibly large. Ignore them. They emerged from the dark, impenetrable tree line, a perfect straight line of deep impressions in the virgin snow. I walked to the edge of the porch and looked down. They were unmistakably human, showcasing 5 distinct toes and a heavy heel, but they were monstrous in scale. Each print was easily 2 feet long and sunk incredibly deep into the powder, suggesting an entity of massive, crushing weight. The feet that made them were entirely bare, flesh pressed directly into the sub-zero snow. And just as Arthur had written, they stopped exactly at the bottom step of the porch. I stared at the final footprint. A strange, heavy lethargy began to wash over me. The rational fear I should have felt was being rapidly replaced by a deep, hypnotic curiosity. The trees where the tracks originated seemed to lean toward me, whispering. The darkness between the moss-draped trunks looked incredibly inviting, like a warm, dark room waiting for me to enter. Where did they come from? A voice in my head whispered, "Just take a few steps into the snow. Just look. It's safe. Come see." I actually placed my boot on the top step, my body moving without my conscious permission. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the dark gap in the tree line. Never, under any circumstances, try to follow the tracks back into the woods. It wants you to follow. The memory of the rule struck me like a physical blow. I violently jerked my foot back, gasping as if pulling my head above water. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had been seconds away from walking directly into the woods. Sweat prickled under my heavy coat. I grabbed the snow shovel, my hands shaking violently, and began to forcefully push piles of snow over the bottom steps, burying the massive footprints, erasing their existence. I didn't look at the trees again. I didn't stop until the tracks were completely covered. I retreated inside, locking the heavy door behind me. I spent the next few hours inventorying cans of soup and checking the antifreeze in the boiler, keeping myself relentlessly occupied. I refused to let my mind wander. By 2:45 p.m., I found myself sitting in one of the dusty, sheet-covered armchairs in the main lobby, staring at the antique rotary phone sitting on a small mahogany table. It was a heavy, black Bakelite model from the 1940s. Its thick, braided fabric cord trailed down the back of the table and ended in a frayed, severed stump on the floor. It wasn't plugged into anything. The copper wires inside the cord were green with oxidation. Physically, scientifically, it was impossible for it to ring. I watched my digital watch. 2:50 p.m. The silence in the lodge was deafening. I could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. I rehearsed the phrase over and over in my head. The master of the house is sleeping. The master of the house is sleeping. 2:58 p.m. I leaned forward, my muscles tense, ready to spring. I had to answer it before the 5th ring. 2:59 p.m. The second hand ticked upward. 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 3 p.m. The phone remained silent. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. Nothing. Maybe the watch was fast. Maybe it was a different time zone. I watched the clock tick to 3:01, then 3:02. The heavy black phone sat dead and lifeless on the table. I let out a nervous, barking laugh, rubbing my hands over my face. "You're losing it, Elias," I muttered to myself. "It's a dead phone. It's a dead piece of plastic." I stood up from the armchair, intending to go back to the kitchen to heat up some soup. I took 3 steps away from the table. Tring! The mechanical brass bell inside the heavy black casing violently shattered the silence. The sound was incredibly loud, harsh, and jarring, echoing off the high timber ceilings. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around. Tring! That was ring 2. I lunged across the space, my boots slightly slipping on the dusty rug. Tring! Ring 3. I slammed my hand down on the heavy black receiver, lifting it from its cradle and pressing it to my ear. I opened my mouth to speak the phrase, but my voice caught in my throat. From the earpiece, I didn't hear the dead hiss of static. I heard breathing. It was heavy, wet, and incredibly close. It sounded exactly like the terrible, rattling inhalations I had heard through the ceiling knothole the night before. But it was intimately close, right against my ear, as if the creature was standing directly behind me, breathing into the mouthpiece. If you hear breathing before you speak, drop the phone and lock yourself in your room until Wednesday. A horrific, wet smacking sound came through the receiver, like thick lips parting to speak. I didn't wait to hear the voice. I didn't say the phrase. I dropped the heavy receiver. It clattered loudly against the mahogany table, dangling by its frayed cord, swinging back and forth like a pendulum. The wet, rattling breathing continued to emanate from the dangling earpiece, filling the dead air of the lobby. I turned and sprinted. I didn't look back. I ran through the great hall, my boots thundering against the wood, tore through the kitchen doors, and threw myself into my quarters. I slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and shoved the heavy oak dresser back into place. I backed away until I hit the far wall, sinking to the floor next to my bed. My chest heaved. I looked at the window, checking the heavy curtains, then at the ceiling, scanning the timber boards. It was barely past 3 in the afternoon, but the shadows in my room already felt long and malicious. I was a prisoner in this tiny space until midnight passed and Wednesday began. I pulled my knees to my chest, the throbbing pain in my burned cheek, a constant reminder of the stakes. I closed my eyes, but in the silence of the room, I could still hear the ghost of that wet, heavy breathing, waiting patiently on the other end of a severed line. Confinement is a crucible. It boils away your sanity, leaving only raw, concentrated paranoia. I spent 17 hours locked inside my small quarters. From 3 p.m. on Tuesday until 8 a.m. on Wednesday, I did not turn the brass knob of my door. I sat with my back pressed against the heavy oak dresser that barricaded me in, listening to the agonizingly slow ticking of my watch. The physical toll was severe. By 2 a.m., my supply of chopped firewood had dwindled to nothing but bark and splinters. The cast-iron stove died, plunging the room into a deep, biting freeze that seeped through the floorboards and into my bones. I wrapped myself tightly in 2 wool blankets, my teeth chattering so violently my jaw ached. My left cheek throbbed with a hot, rhythmic pain, the blistered burn weeping fluid into the sterile gauze. But the psychological torture was worse. The lodge was never truly silent. The wind screamed down the chimneys, sounding like dying animals. The timber groaned, and every few hours I swore I heard the soft, wet slosh of heavy footsteps pacing back and forth in the kitchen, just on the other side of my door. Something was waiting for me. It knew I was in here. When Wednesday morning finally broke, painting the frosted window pane in hues of dull gray, I waited an extra hour just to be certain. At exactly 8 a.m., my muscles stiff and screaming in protest, I pushed the heavy dresser away from the door. I gripped my tactical flashlight in my left hand and a heavy steel fireplace poker in my right. I turned the deadbolt. Click. I pushed the door open and stepped into the kitchen. It was empty. The air was bitterly cold, so cold my breath plumed instantly. But there were no monsters hiding behind the prep tables, no root-like hands reaching from the industrial sinks, just the hollow, dusty emptiness of the lodge. I needed to check the generator, but more pressingly, I needed to figure out why it was so unfathomably cold. The lodge was drafty, yes, but this was different. This was the raw, biting temperature of the outside world, unfiltered by walls or insulation. I walked cautiously through the swinging doors into the great hall. The leather sofas under their white sheets looked undisturbed. The mounted animal heads remained frozen in their dusty vigilance. I moved toward the main lobby, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the gloom. As I rounded the corner of the grand staircase, my heart plummeted directly into my stomach. The massive double oak front doors of Blackwood Falls Lodge were standing wide open. They weren't forced. They hadn't been blown open by the wind. The heavy iron deadbolt had been cleanly turned. The thick brass chain had been unslid from its track and left dangling perfectly straight. Someone, or something, had walked up to those doors, unlocked them from the inside, and pulled them open. A massive drift of pure white snow had blown into the lobby, burying the antique Persian rug and piling up against the mahogany table where the dead rotary phone still dangled by its frayed cord. The howling mountain wind was funneling directly into the lodge, bringing the sub-zero Cascade winter inside. Rule 6. If you find a door open that you know you locked, lock it again and say loudly, "The wind is fierce tonight." Do not acknowledge that someone opened it. I knew I had locked it. I had checked every single exterior door on my first day. I had slid that brass chain into place myself. My grip tightened around the iron fireplace poker until my knuckles turned white. My instincts screamed at me to run back to my room, but if I left the doors open, the lodge's internal temperature would plummet further. The pipes would freeze and burst within the hour. I would die of exposure. I had to close them. I stepped into the lobby, my boots crunching loudly on the fresh snow that had accumulated on the floor. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the heavy brass handles of the open doors. But as I drew closer, my peripheral vision betrayed me. Behind the right door, standing in the narrow shadowed wedge between the heavy oak and the stone wall, was a figure. I froze mid-step, my lungs seizing. I forced my eyes to stare straight ahead at the snowy driveway, refusing to look directly at the corner. But my peripheral sight painted a terrifyingly vivid picture. It was tall. Impossibly tall. Its head nearly brushed the 10-foot ceiling of the lobby. It was draped in a tattered, heavy yellow parka, the kind of extreme weather gear an ice fisher or a deep winter hiker might wear. But the parka was filthy, smeared with black grease and dark, rusted stains. And it was standing completely still, facing the stone wall, its back to me. Do not acknowledge that someone opened it. The rule echoed in my mind, a frantic, desperate mantra. If I screamed, if I raised the iron poker, if I even looked directly at it, I would be acknowledging its presence. I would be validating the horrific reality that I was not alone in this lodge. I had to close the door. I had to reach around the massive, silent figure to grab the brass handle. I forced my right boot forward. Crunch. The figure did not move. It didn't breathe. It stood as rigid as a petrified tree. I took another step. I was now standing inside the threshold. The freezing wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my burnt cheek. The smell radiating from the corner hit me, a suffocating wave of wet dog, ancient dust, and copper wire. I extended my trembling left hand toward the brass handle of the open door. To reach it, the sleeve of my jacket came within an inch of the tattered yellow parka. I could feel an unnatural, radiating cold coming off the entity, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. My fingers wrapped around the freezing brass handle. Suddenly, from deep within the hood of the yellow parka, a sound emerged. It was a low, wet, clicking noise. It sounded like a jaw being unhinged, bone grinding against bone. Ignore it. Ignore it. Ignore it! I pulled the heavy oak door toward me. As the door swung shut, the wedge of space in the corner compressed. The entity was forced to shift. I heard the heavy, wet slosh of a boot dragging against the stone floor. It was stepping closer to my back. I slammed the door shut. The booming echo rattled the glass in the lobby windows. My hands flew over the locks. I threw the heavy iron deadbolt. Clack! I grabbed the brass chain, my fingers fumbling clumsily in my terror, and slid it into the track. Click! The door was secured. I was standing inches away from it, and the entity in the yellow parka was standing directly behind me. I could feel the space between my shoulder blades turning to ice. I could hear that wet, clicking jaw hovering just inches from the back of my neck. It was waiting for me to turn around. It was waiting for me to scream. I closed my eyes, swallowed the massive lump of absolute terror in my throat, and spoke the phrase to the closed wooden door. My voice shook, but the words were clear. "The wind is fierce tonight." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I had ever experienced. It pressed down on my shoulders. I released the brass handle. I did not turn around. Acting with every ounce of theatrical willpower I possessed, I pretended I was a man entirely alone in an empty house. I turned sharply to my left, keeping my eyes fixed on the mahogany table. I walked. 1 step, 2 steps. The clicking sound behind me stopped. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk at a normal, casual pace back across the snowy lobby, past the dangling rotary phone and into the great hall. I expected to feel heavy hands grab my shoulders. I expected to be violently pulled backward into the dark. Every nerve ending in my body was screaming at me to sprint, to seek cover, to fight. I walked all the way back to the kitchen, pushed through the swinging doors, and finally, mercifully, stepped into my bedroom. I closed my door. I locked it. I leaned against it, sliding slowly down the wood until I hit the floor. I buried my face in my hands, a silent, hysterical laugh bubbling up in my chest. I had done it. I had followed the rule to the letter, and I was still alive. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a new, horrifying realization took root in my mind. The front doors were locked again. The heavy brass chain was secured. I had locked the lodge down tight to keep the winter out, but I hadn't let the thing in the yellow parka leave. I hadn't locked the monsters out of Blackwood Falls Lodge. I had just locked myself inside with them. Time in absolute isolation does not pass. It accumulates. It builds up in the corners of your mind like black mold, feeding on the damp darkness of your fears. I survived December. I survived January. By the time the bitter, unforgiving end of February arrived, I was no longer the Elias Vance who had driven up the mountain. I was a gaunt, hollow-eyed phantom of a man. I had lost 20 pounds. The burn on my cheek had healed into a jagged, shiny white scar that pulled the corner of my left eye downward, giving my face a perpetual expression of horrified skepticism. My entire existence had been reduced to a punishing, terrified choreography. I pumped the diesel. I cleared the snow. I ignored the giant footprints. On Tuesdays, I ran to the ringing dead phone, whispered the phrase, and fled. Every night between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., I lay paralyzed in my bed, listening to the heavy, wet meat slosh across my ceiling, waiting for the black acid to drip from the knothole. I followed the rules with the obsessive, religious devotion of a fanatic, and for 3 months, the rules kept me alive. The lodge and I had reached a terrible equilibrium until February 26th, the night the lodge decided it was done playing by the rules. It started at 1:15 a.m. I was lying awake in my bed, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, waiting for the 2 a.m. shift to begin. The generator was running in the basement, its steady, distant thrum a comforting anchor in the raging blizzard outside. Suddenly, The thrum was violently interrupted by an agonizing shriek of tearing metal. It sounded as if the massive engine block had been forcefully ripped in half. The floorboards shuddered so violently my bed frame rattled against the wall. Then, absolute, dead silence. The power died instantly. The orange glow of my cast-iron stove was the only light left in the freezing darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule 1. If the humming stops, you have exactly 10 minutes to get to the basement and restart it. I threw off the blankets, my breath pluming in the freezing air, and grabbed my flashlight and a heavy iron fireplace poker. I unlocked my door and stepped into the pitch-black kitchen. I had done this run dozens of times now, but tonight felt fundamentally wrong. The air pressure in the lodge was crushing, suffocating. I pushed through the swinging doors into the great hall. The beam of my flashlight swept across the room and stopped dead. Standing in the center of the hall, directly between me and the basement door, was the figure in the tattered yellow parka. It wasn't facing the wall this time. It was facing me. The hood was pulled back, but where a face should have been, there was only a writhing mass of rusted, oxidized copper wire and what looked like human teeth woven into the metal. The wet, bone-grinding, clicking sound filled the cavernous room. I froze. I couldn't go to the basement. It was blocking the path. The 10-minute window was ticking down. Then, from the main lobby behind the figure, the antique rotary phone began to ring. Tring, tring! It was 1:20 a.m. on a Thursday. The phone was only supposed to ring on Tuesdays at 3 p.m. The rules were breaking down. The contract was void. Squish! Thud! The sound came from the ceiling directly above me in the great hall. I looked up. The massive, wet entity wasn't waiting for 2 a.m. It was awake early, and the timber above my head was already beginning to warp violently under its immense weight. A drop of black, foul-smelling acid hit the hardwood floor 2 feet away from my boots, sizzling loudly. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, consumed me. The lodge wasn't a shelter anymore. It was a digestive tract, and the enzymes had just been released. I wasn't going to survive the night if I stayed. I didn't think about the $50,000. I didn't think about the mobsters in Seattle. I only thought about the keys to my Subaru Outback, which were sitting on my nightstand. I abandoned the generator. I spun around, sprinted back into my bedroom, grabbed my car keys, my heavy parka, and my boots. I didn't bother packing clothes. I shoved my feet into the freezing leather boots, threw the coat over my shoulders, and grabbed the iron poker. I charged back into the kitchen. The sloshing footsteps above were tracking me perfectly, moving faster than they ever had before, directly over my head. I hit the swinging doors, bursting back into the great hall. The yellow parka figure had moved. It was now standing directly in front of the basement door, its copper wire face twitching aggressively, the teeth clacking together in a frenzied rhythm. I didn't look at it. I kept my eyes fixed on the massive oak front doors at the far end of the lobby. The rotary phone was still screaming, "Terring, terring." I ran. I sprinted across the dusty Persian rugs, my lungs burning in the freezing air. As I passed the grand staircase, I glanced toward the lobby window. Standing on the porch, looking through the frosted glass, was the deer. Its neck was twisted at a grotesque, broken angle. The left antler was jagged and snapped, and its forward-facing predatory eyes locked directly onto mine. Rule 4. If you turn your back on it while it is watching you, it will be inside the lodge by the time you turn around. I couldn't back away slowly. I didn't have time. The ceiling above me was groaning, raining dust and splinters onto my shoulders. The black acid was beginning to drip in a steady line behind me. I made a choice. I broke the rule. I broke eye contact, put my head down, and hurled myself at the front doors. I hit the heavy oak with my shoulder, frantically fumbling with the brass chain and the deadbolt. My hands were shaking so violently I dropped the iron poker. It clattered uselessly onto the floor. Behind me, I heard the horrific sound of glass shattering. The window caved in. The heavy thud of hooves hit the wooden floor of the lobby. It was inside. I unlocked the deadbolt. I ripped the door open, throwing myself out into the raging, howling blizzard. The wind hit me like a freight train, the snow blindingly thick. The temperature was easily 20 below zero. The pristine snow of the driveway was completely ruined, trampled by dozens of impossibly large barefoot tracks circling my Subaru. I waded through the waist-deep snow, moving entirely on adrenaline. The cold immediately bit through my thermals, but I couldn't feel it. I reached the driver's side door, jammed the key into the frozen lock, and wrenched it open. I threw myself into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it instantly. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked sluggishly, fighting the freezing oil. "Run, run, run. Come on!" I screamed, slamming my hand against the steering wheel. "Come on!" Through the windshield, barely visible through the swirling snow, the front doors of Blackwood Falls Lodge stood wide open. Standing in the threshold was the figure in the yellow parka. Next to it stood the deer, its broken neck twitching, and slowly, oozing down the doorframe like thick black tar, something massive and wet was dragging itself out of the darkness. I turned the key again, pumping the gas pedal. The Subaru coughed, sputtered, and finally roared to life. The headlights pierced the blizzard, illuminating the massive barefoot tracks leading down the gravel road. I slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires spun wildly in the snow, fishtailing the back end before the all-wheel drive finally caught traction. The car lurched forward, plowing through the heavy drifts. I didn't look back at the lodge. I kept my eyes entirely focused on the narrow, treacherous path of Route 118, praying the tires would hold the road. The heater blasted freezing air against my face, slowly warming up, defrosting my numb fingers. I had made it. I had escaped the perimeter. The adrenaline began to peak and crash, leaving me weeping uncontrollably, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they cramped. The 12-mile descent down the mountain was a white-knuckle nightmare, but the road was mercifully devoid of obstacles. About 5 miles down, the heater finally began to blow warm air. I let out a long, ragged, hysterical sigh of relief. I was alive. I was going to Oakhaven. I didn't have the money, but I had my life. Then I remembered the kid at the Oakhaven gas station, Arthur. Left his truck running at the gates and walked the 12 miles down the mountain in a blizzard. Lost 3 toes to frostbite. Said the truck wouldn't let him leave alone. Said there was someone sitting in the back seat every time he looked in the rear view. The warmth of the heater suddenly felt like the stifling heat of a grave. The cabin of the Subaru was small. I could feel the cold radiating from the back windows. But I could also feel something else. A dense, heavy presence pressing against the back of my seat. A smell began to fill the car. It wasn't the smell of old coffee and pine air freshener. It was the suffocating, unmistakable odor of wet dog, ancient dust, and rusted copper wire. And then, from directly behind my right ear, came a sound. Click, clack, grind. It was the wet, bone-grinding sound of a jaw unhinging. My eyes darted toward the rear-view mirror. My brain begged me not to look, screaming at me to keep my eyes on the road. But the instinct was too powerful. I looked in the mirror. Sitting dead center in the back seat of my Subaru, filling the entire rear window, was the figure in the tattered yellow parka. The writhing mass of copper wire and human teeth that made up its face was inches from the back of my headrest. My foot instinctively hovered over the brake pedal. The urge to slam on the brakes, throw the car into park, and run screaming into the freezing night, just like Arthur had done, was almost unbearable. If I stopped the car, I could run. I might lose my toes, but I could get away from it. I looked back at the snow-covered road ahead. Rule 6. If you find a door open that you know you locked, lock it again and say loudly, "The wind is fierce tonight." Do not acknowledge that someone opened it. The entity had breached my locked car. It was sitting in my back seat. It wanted me to stop. It wanted me to panic. It wanted me to acknowledge it. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel until my knuckles cracked. I forced my foot down on the accelerator, keeping the speedometer steady at 30 miles per hour. I stared straight ahead into the blinding blizzard, ignoring the freezing breath on the back of my neck. I took a deep, shaky breath and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice to the empty road ahead of me. "The wind is fierce tonight." The clicking sound in the back seat abruptly stopped. I didn't look in the rearview mirror again. Not for the next 7 miles. Not when the glow of the Oakhaven gas station finally pierced the storm. Not even when I parked under the flickering fluorescent lights and collapsed over the steering wheel, sobbing until I threw up. When I finally gathered the courage to turn around, the back seat was empty. The only thing left was a single rusted piece of copper wire resting on the upholstery. I never went back for the $50,000. I left my Subaru at the Oakhaven gas station, traded my watch to a trucker for a ride to the nearest train station, and disappeared. The mob found me a year later, but when they saw the scarred, haunted wreck of a man I had become, they broke my nose, took what little cash I had in my pocket, and left me alone. They said I looked like a ghost anyway. I live in a small, well-lit apartment in the desert now. I don't own a mirror. I don't answer the phone. And I never, under any circumstances, look over my shoulder when it's dark.